rock and roll all night. And since you are ephemera collectors out there, I won't ask you to give it up for Mr. Inciardi, but I would like you to put your hands together in a ephemera-grabbing way to welcome him.
I'm very happy to be here. I saw many of the lectures yesterday, and I thought they were very interesting, very well done, and very informative, and it actually helped me inform exactly how I was going to do the presentation tonight, so thank you for yesterday. I've worked at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame since 1991. It opened in 95. I was there 4 years prior to the opening. And when I started working there, we only had 3 items that could have fit on the top of this podium. So we had a large building that was just about to break ground, 125,000 square feet. And so we had a really daunting task. But I don't know how many of you have been to Cleveland before, but the museum is thriving, so I would encourage any of you that haven't been there to go. I began collecting ephemera as a kid living in Miami. In elementary school, it began with collecting ticket stubs, mostly from movie theaters. My father was sort of fascinated with my interest in ticket stubs. One day he came home with an unused roll of tickets that would have been used at a carnival, thinking that I would like that. But there wasn't any real memory involved in going to those specific events. But I still do have that wheel of tickets. It's the size of a manhole cover almost. At the time, Sotheby's was conducting auctions of memorabilia, and I was lucky enough to get a job at Sotheby's to do basically what I was envisioning I was going to do in college. In 1980, after John Lennon died, let me see here. The ephemera market for rock and roll really took off. A lot of John Lennon's friends started auctioning things he had given them or that he had left at their houses, and that sort of launched the market. It was sort of really an underground activity before then. I don't know how much of you know about the sort of the rock and roll ephemera market now, but you know, posters can go for over $200,000 for a single poster now. And when you consider that some of those items are only 40 years old, I think that's quite significant. At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, people are always asking us, what is rock and roll? And my answer usually is, well, you know it when you hear it, and you all know what it is. But if you wanted to give it a definition, you could say that it's a cross-pollination of blues, gospel, folk, and country music. You could also, a more simplification would be Elvis, mid-50s, a white man playing black music.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true? You done started doing the things you used to do.
So, this is a boxing style poster from 1957. It's called a boxing style poster because that was the same format that the heavyweight fights, the designs that they would use to promote the big boxing matches. And this was produced by the Globe Poster Company. Um, and this is actually quite an interesting piece. It really conveys so much information. You really, for a rock and roll museum, you can't do any better than this. Um, you know, this poster basically documents the beginning of Chuck Berry's career. He had been playing maybe professionally 2-3 years prior to this. This poster is from a venue in West Virginia, and like most rock posters, the actual year of the poster is never printed on the poster because, again, it's a piece of ephemera. It was put on a telephone pole a week or two before the show. But you can date it because the two songs up there, Maybelline and School Days, which came out in 1957. I don't know if you can see it, right there it says, reserved section for white spectators. And one of the things about rock and roll is that it's really intertwined with race. So this poster is just a perfect example of the Jim Crow South. The artists weren't able to stay in the hotels. The crowd was segregated. One of the talks yesterday by Patrick Sweeney on tour at the turn of the century, is he here? No. I don't know if any of you were there, but he talked about circuits. He was referring to the vaudeville days. And this venue was part of what's called the Chitlin Circuit. I don't know if any of you have heard that term, but it started in the early 20th century. And basically it was a circuit of towns that black artists could perform at without being harassed or arrested. And so this is a venue, the Bluefield Auditorium, where someone like Chuck Berry could check into a hotel, get paid pretty well, and get out of town, intact. The poster also, if you sort of dig into it, it reveals a lot about geography and migration in the mid part of the 20th century. So this is another poster from the same venue. It's just fascinating to see the, it says colored spectators $1.50, and then admission is $2.50. It's just very interesting that this was still occurring at this point. The lithography here, I think, is pretty terrific. It's not very intricate, but it's bold, and it, again, was something that was supposed to try to grab your attention while you were driving by, walking by. Again, it was probably put on a construction site. Some of them would have been installed into the glass lobby, those cabinets that you saw in the front of the theaters. Not all posters from this period have a photograph of the artist in them, which would make this much more collectible. The image on the right is an illustration that was commissioned by Rolling Stone magazine for a special issue they did in the year 2000 about the icons of rock, and I just included it here just as a visual reference because it's hard to see Richard there in the top right of the poster. What's interesting about Richard, a lot of people don't know, is he's gay, and as a as a performer in the 1950s, that was not an easy thing. But he didn't really hide it all that much. If for anyone that has ever seen the amount of makeup he wears, the way he moves, the way he talks, and you can just see here the way he looks. He looks like he could be a transvestite there in 1957. Little music.
A bullet from the back of a bush took Medgar Evers' blood. A finger fired the trigger to his name.
So it's obviously Bob Dylan. There's a lot of music, obviously, that came in between Richard and Chuck Berry and Bob Dylan, but a lot of scholars sort of there wasn't a whole lot of exciting music going on in the late 50s until Bob Dylan came around. Buddy Holly had died, Chuck Berry was in jail, and Elvis was in the Army. So there was a lot of Fabian and Bobby Rydell, Bobby V, and that music really was not all that substantial. So there's two pieces here. On the left is a page from a folk publication called Sing Out. That's obviously very collectible. And I'm sure somebody here has run across a copy before. And again, keeping with the theme of race, the song here, He's Only a Pawn in Their Game, is written about the civil rights leader Medgar Evers, who was shot in 1963. And Bob Dylan just, on the fly, wrote a song about him. And this is an actual piece that he inscribed some of the lyrics on the side. So it's not a working manuscript, because the song had already been written, but it's something that he inscribed during the period, which I think makes it really interesting. On the right, this is a handbill, so it's only about that big, from a coffee house in Syracuse, New York. Bob Dylan in '63 was not an international legend at that point, and he was still playing small venues. It was before he went electric, before he became a rock star. But even this early, people really noticed him, and one of his biggest fans at this point was Bob Dylan, was John Lennon. And I just like how simple, the way that it was. This is something that probably there would have been a stack of these in a coffee house. This is sort of a standard design, and they would have just changed the graphics, from one night to the next. Here's more Bob. The show on the left here, Carnegie Hall, 1963, was a really groundbreaking show for him. The New York Times music critic Robert Shelton wrote about him, gave him a great review at this show, and that basically launched his career internationally, based on that one New York Times piece. Joan Baez, who had been a folk star way earlier than Bob Dylan, took Bob on the road and did him a real service. And they dated for a couple of years, and they really learned a lot from each other. They performed at the March on Washington in 1963, along with a lot of other artists, Pete Seeger, Odetta, and they performed in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This jumps a couple of years. It's convenient. My office is located within the offices of Rolling Stone magazine. So I get to see a lot of interesting things that are in their archives. And this is a piece of stationery from 1967. This is from Jan Wenner, the owner of Rolling Stone's archive. And he essentially named the magazine after the Bob Dylan song, Like a Rolling Stone, and then he named it after the Rolling Stones and the Muddy Waters song. But it was really Bob Dylan, I think, was Jan Wenner's main obsession, and it took him a year to finally get Bob Dylan's phone number and then get Bob to call him back. So this was a big keepsake of his. And so that number's from Woodstock. I think Woodstock now has probably an 845 area code. I think that's just a great, simple little piece there. And Bob already at that point was, he was already sort of cultivating his personality, and he became this cryptic person. So naturally, he'd never return a phone call initially. You had to call him 50 times, and then he finally got back to you. So, two posters from the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones, they were part of the British invasion. They came to America from England along with the Beatles, the Animals, the Yardbirds, and they were all these young British kids who had discovered American blues music across the pond, reinterpreted it themselves, and then brought it, sort of re-exported it back to the United States in their own, but it essentially became their own music. And the Rolling Stones were an instant success. Less than 7-8 months from the time they formed, they were gigantic stars. They were cultivating a really sort of bad boy image, and you can see in the images here, they sort of look like X-rays. They're sort of saturated, and their manager consciously was trying to distinguish them from the Beatles, who had a much more sort of cleaned up look to them. Their posters are incredibly collected and very popular. The one on the right, you could see at the bottom, it says Cow Palace, and that's a venue in Northern California that was an actual, I guess it was like a venue where you buy and sell cows. It was like for dairy. It was like for the dairy business, and it's still there, and everybody uses it. The cattle business is still there. There's still shows going on. So the one on the right is one of my favorite posters. Just as an aside, my wife, who's over there, works for the Rolling Stones, and she is their archivist. She takes care of their collection. Okay.
Hey, Joe. Where you going with that?
So Jimi Hendrix, he's sort of, my explanation about the British invasion, he was, a young kid from Seattle who had to go to England to get discovered. So he couldn't get arrested in the United States, but he became a big star in England and then came back to the United States and, you know, becomes this international star. You know, these are just, there's not much I can actually say about these posters. They're just typical, I would describe these as typical sort of middle of the road designed posters from the late 60s. I think what's cool is the one on the left is from Honolulu, and the station's call letters are K Poi, which I think was really sort of tacky. But it's interesting, even though the design of these posters, you know, are just fine, they're incredibly sought after because they were printed in very, very small numbers. Again, we're talking $7,000, $8,000 each for these right now. Here's another Jimi Hendrix poster. You know, as we get later into the 60s and the psychedelic, the drug movement starts, when people start taking LSD and mushrooms and smoking pot, hallucinogenic drugs, a lot of kids in art schools started designing posters for rock bands, their friends, their, you know, the artists that they were fans of. So this is a perfect example of, you know, a psychedelic inspired poster. You know, so if you think about how different this was just from the Bob Dylan poster from '63, it's only 3.5 years later, and that's a really, really radical change. So I wanted to sort of break things up because in the rock and roll ephemera world, there are a couple of different categories. There's posters and handbills, there's telegrams, there's contracts, letters, photographs, and then there are items that I would say, you know, they're documents. And so this is a receipt from Manny's Music in New York on 48th Street in New York. It used to be called Music Row. There were, at the peak, maybe 15 stores on that street, and sadly now they're all gone because the real estate has just, that area has just gone completely insane. But what's interesting about this is Jimi Hendrix had an account at Manny's, and he would go in there anytime he wanted, usually in a limousine, and whatever he wanted, he just grabbed and left. So this one he signed at the bottom. And the holy grail for this type of item, a receipt, would be if the receipt was for a guitar, and if the serial number of the guitar were on the receipt. I have seen, unfortunately, receipts that have been forged because somebody has a guitar that is from 1968 and it looks similar to one in a photograph from Jimi Hendrix, and then poof, they've got $500,000. So that, in this world, when you see a receipt like that, you have to be very, very careful. And at the top, it's got the name of his his management company. So the bills for whatever he bought went to some office at 280 Madison Avenue. And you can also see his name is spelled wrong. It's spelled Jimmy, Jimmy, and he spelled it Jimi. So here's a more a great example of a psychedelic poster. This is Big Brother and the Holding Company, that Janis Joplin was the singer in the band for several years. Again, another psychedelic inspired image. And she came out of Port Arthur, Texas, in the sort of blues shouter tradition of Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, both of them being black women. She was a tremendous talent and just, died way too early. The poster on the right, it's hard to see, but Janis Joplin is wearing this black velvet dress with this beading on it, and it's the dress that she wore at the Monterey Pop Festival, where she sort of was discovered. And a friend of mine actually owns that dress, and it's sitting in his house in Manhattan. Yeah. Just pointing out one other thing on the right, underneath where you see Janis Joplin, you see James Cotton Blues Band, and he was a black blues artist from the 50s. And because a lot of white artists discovered the blues and rhythm and blues, it really gave people that had been forgotten a living. And for people like Chuck Berry, it made them very wealthy because he had written so many amazing songs that later were covered by the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, to this day. Just more posters here. It's a Grateful Dead poster on the left, and Big Mama Thornton was another one of those blues shouters who had been completely forgotten, and the Grateful Dead loved her and brought her out on the road with them. So what she must have seen, I have no idea. Dealing with them. It's another Big Brother, another Big Brother in the holding company poster. Which one? You were? Wow. $3.50 for a ticket. What do you remember of the show? Yeah. Here's the Yardbirds, British band that had three separate fantastic guitar players that were in the band. First, Eric Clapton. He left the band because he felt that they were getting too pop and they were straying too much from their blues roots. Then Jeff Beck joined the band, and then he remained in the band for a bit, and then Jimmy Page, who later would form Led Zeppelin, was in the band. So they had an overabundance of talent. I just loved this poster. It incorporated the band's logo, and in the early days, in the mid-'60s, you just didn't see a consistency of the logo of a band from poster to poster. The poster on the right is from The Who. They sort of were part of the second wave of the British invasion, so they didn't come over in '64. They came over later in '66, I believe. And that's Roger Daltrey on the left. He always wore fringe, and he didn't play an instrument, so what he would do is he would have the microphone on a cord, and he would twirl it around like a weapon. That's Pete Townsend on the right. So this is a double bill poster for Cream, which is the next band that Eric Clapton was in with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. And then you have the Electric Flag, which was a psychedelic group that was relatively short-lived, but that were quite good. And again, you could see already that there's a huge variety in the style and the execution of the posters. This one, you know, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as psychedelic, but you could see it's getting this sort of Baroque look to it at this point. More from The Who. The one on the left is sponsored by the record company, and that's something that happened much later as things got more commercial. The poster on the right, I really like the image of Pete Townsend, and you can tell the photographer who took the shot, I don't know if that's like a triple exposure in one image or if they just took 3 shots and laid it on top of each other, but you can see the motion, and you can just tell that, again, this is only 3-4 years after that Bob Dylan poster, and it's 10 years after that Chuck Berry poster, and you could just see how quickly things changed in the 1960s. This is a little hard to see. Do we have any music for this one? I can't remember. No? Okay. So this is a set list, handwritten set list for a Rolling Stones concert from 1970. And these are incredibly rare. They kept almost nothing like this. This is one of the only ones known from this period. I'm just looking at some of the names of the songs. Brown Sugar, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Honky Tonk Women, Tumblin' Dice, and then if anybody wants to come up, if you're interested, the key that each song is in is written next to the song, and they would have had to stagger the set, the order in which they did the songs, depending on what keys the songs were in, because they often had different tunings of the guitars from one song to the next, so they weren't going to retune the guitar after every song. The only band that did that was the Grateful Dead, because the shows went on for 4 hours, and Mick Jagger was way too much of a businessman. You know, he wanted the show to run like clockwork, which it did. So again, something like this is probably worth 50 grand. I just thought I'd throw in a picture of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The building was designed by I.M. Pei, and I love the building, but it's a love-hate relationship because there's a lot of light that comes in, and so everybody in this room knows when it comes to paper, sunlight is the worst. So we have a lot of area that cannot, that there can't be any paper. So we have cars hanging from the ceilings in there. Some of the guitars are sort of durable enough, but we certainly, no clothing either. Clothing is just as bad as paper. And this was designed not long after his designs for the additions to the Louvre. So that's why he was in his sort of pyramid phase at that point. It's just that it took the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame longer than expected to raise the money to build the building. So by the time that this building was built, he was already way past the pyramid style. This is a picture, that's Graham Nash from Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and I just wanted to show one of the exhibits that we've done that is very ephemera heavy. Um, Graham Nash is unusual in that not only does he keep everything, but he actively collects material from other artists. So he collects manuscripts from Bob Dylan and Jim Morrison. Really funny is in this case on the right, you see a piece of wood right here. This has nothing to do with rock and roll, but that's a piece of the fence from the grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza in Dallas. And who knows how long that, he took that in like 1970. So who knows if that was the fence that was there when Kennedy was killed. But he tells a good story. And then there's the pictures in that case are from the day of the assassination. This was really fun. This is, if you can, let's see if I can actually read a little of this. Correspondence in the rock world is great if you can get something that has good content and is from the right period. So this is a postcard written from Madonna to one of her closest friends when she was a sophomore at Michigan. And it says, Andina, thank you for the endearing letter. Unfortunately, our performance this weekend took place, but there's not, hold on. I'm not good with her handwriting. Hold on to your pants. I'm sorry, I haven't been able to phone you, but I'm a busy girl, you know. I got my hair cornrowed. It's really a groove. I guess this is probably around the time that that movie 10 came out that Bo Derek was in. I hate school, but I love to dance. I'm going to New York this summer. I will try to dance for Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. The weather is shitty, and I got a fantastic new job at a really hot bar, and I've taken in love with a fellow employee. He's tall, black, and so beautiful. I'm happy. I hope you are too. Yeah. Yeah, crazy shithead. So isn't that classic? Yeah. Yeah. So like items like this are just such a snapshot of a, you know, it doesn't even have to be a rock musician. It could be, you know, a painter, a writer, an economist. You know, if you get that letter that is just when they're on the cusp of something great, it's very revealing. This is a funny one. I've been pursuing for a collection for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame literally for 20 years, Elton John. And he's lovely, but every single time we ask, we get the same answer. Everything has been sold to raise money for AIDS, which is great. So he inducted Leon Russell, who's a piano player, into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame about 5 years ago. And he was staying at the St. Regis Hotel the night before, and this is his speech. He wrote down a list of the artists that he felt that basically he and Leon Russell had in common, and you know they were both sort of kindred spirits. So these were the notes for his speech, basically that he extemporaneized. Anyway, so that was really fun. Little music? Oh, no? Okay. Okay. Anyway, so these are Michael Jackson's lyrics to Billie Jean. And they were, this is not this is not the first, first or second draft, I would say. This is a complete manuscript that he brought into the studio to do the vocal track. So this was when he had finished writing the song, brought everything in, has the notes there, on there, and he would have put this on a music stand or held it when he recorded the song, and then he signed it and gave it to a friend, because normally you would not sign a manuscript unless you were giving it to somebody. Though I've seen exceptions to that. Terrible handwriting. So the market has really changed a lot since John Lennon's passing. It's obviously, that's quite a long time now. And a lot of musicians are now selling all of their selling their manuscripts, their papers, telegrams, and Lou Reed is one of the people that has done that. And as a curator at a nonprofit, we don't have unlimited funds. Is fun working? So his collection was sold to the New York Public Library for around $2 million. We don't have an exact figure, but it was a sizable amount of paper. And he's very much a New York artist, so I think it made sense that his collection went there. And they just keep doing it. So Bruce Springsteen, he donated his archive to a college in New Jersey, so he has a real attachment. It was a community college at the time. And then this was actually on the front page of the New York Times a couple of years ago. Bob Dylan sold his collection to the Kaiser Family Foundation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for approximately $40 million. So no one's going to top that. I mean, unless you're anybody that has a collection that's that large at this point wouldn't be selling it, but he did. He had his own reasons for doing that. Paul McCartney's collection is probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's the end of the presentation, but I would certainly love to take any questions. No. There's not too many of them, and the reason that I didn't show anything like that is that the people that have them, they're so protective and not of having them, they don't even want the image shopped around. But the most valuable rock and roll posters are from the Beatles at Shea Stadium. They produced almost none. Like, they might have produced 50 of them, and only 4 have survived. Yeah. Right, right, right. Mm-hmm. Yep. They mark them, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. And we have a lot of British posters, we have a lot of the uh, Fillmore posters, that are pretty common because they did large print runs of those. They, they've opened a museum and research center in Tulsa, and it's already open. And they started with the Woody Guthrie archive, so they bought that first. They bought the Guthrie collection from the Guthrie family, and then paid a ungodly amount of money. And then Dylan, being such a devotee of Guthrie, felt that it would be a good place for his papers to go to. No, I, I mean, I think it probably had to do with whoever made the poster on that given day and how comfortable they were describing the kind of music and the kind of people that were going to be coming to the show. The first time was in Newport, Rhode Island, um, and but what happened was he would after that he would do half the show acoustic and then half the show electric, and all the folkies knew that the electric guitar, the Fender Strat, was coming out, and they booed him with pleasure. It was like a calculated thing at that point. Like, we're going to go to the Dylan show and we're going to boo Bob. That's what they did. And then everybody got over it. Yeah. Are they world, well, I don't, I don't know that database. I'm not an archivist. We have a library and an archive in Cleveland. Um, yeah, yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. That was really rocking. Really great. Well, that really concludes the evening festivities. And as we go out, I'm going to have a little serenade with something I found on my cell phone just for walking out. You're just walking out. The evening's over, and just to see if you think it's appropriate or not. But good night, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming.